Do you remember those poor man meals that fed families when money was gone but love stayed? In African American kitchens, they turned scraps into strength and pride. When did we stop making them and forget what they stood for? Molasses milk was a quiet miracle in a cup. Warmed on the stove and stirred with a spoonful of Blackstrap molasses, it offered sweetness that felt like comfort itself. It was the morning fuel for sharecroppers, mill workers, and children getting ready for long days ahead. The deep, earthy taste filled the body with strength and the spirit with calm. Molasses came from sugarcane, thick and dark, rich in iron and memory. It reminded people of home, of survival, of times when a little sweetness went a long way. Some drank it hot before heading to the fields, others sipped it at night when the chills settled in. There was nothing fancy about it, but that was its beauty, warmth made from patience. Families passed the habit down like a secret handshake of endurance. Molasses milk wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual of hope poured into a chipped cup, a small act of defiance against hunger and fatigue. Cornbread and buttermilk was supper disguised as simplicity. A bowl of crumbled, day-old cornbread soaked in cold buttermilk was how many ended their day, cheap, filling, and quietly satisfying. It wasn't a meal for company, but for peace. You'd sit on the porch, spoon in hand, watching the sky dim, each bite mixing tang with warmth. The sour milk softened the crumbs, turning yesterday's bread into something soft and familiar. It was cooling on hot nights, easy to digest, and full of quiet joy. For elders, it tasted like childhood. For children, it tasted like home. Some added honey or salt, others left it plain. Every house had its own way. It was food for when there wasn't much left in the pantry, yet it filled more than stomachs. Cornbread and buttermilk fed the soul too, reminding weary hearts that comfort didn't come from plenty, but from gratitude. Fried apple hand pies were the dessert of working hands. Made from bruised or leftover apples that couldn't sell, they were chopped, sweetened with sugar water, and wrapped in scraps of dough. Fried until golden, they smelled like comfort itself, cinnamon, fruit, and hot oil blending in the air. These little turnovers fit right into lunch pails and children's hands alike. The crust crackled as you bit into it, revealing warm, spiced fruit inside. They didn't need ovens, only a skillet and a little oil, the tools every kitchen already had. People fried them before Sunday service or packed them for road trips that never went far. It wasn't about waste, it was about making sweetness from what was left. In towns where money was short, a fried apple pie could turn an ordinary day into a small celebration. They disappeared quickly, but their memory lingered. Proof that even in scarcity, love found a way to taste like plenty. Grease bread turned leftovers into luxury. When butter ran out, and it often did, folks spread bacon or sausage grease across slices of bread. The flavor was smoky, salty, and deeply satisfying. You'd fry it on a pan until the edges crisped and the center stayed soft. The scent filled the kitchen like a promise of something better. Some used it for breakfast, others for supper when nothing else was left to make. It was a working man's toast, born from necessity and flavored with pride. That same grease seasoned the greens, beans, and memories that kept families going. Children would ask for extra pieces, licking their fingers when the last crumbs were gone. Grease bread was proof that flavor didn't come from money. It came from making do and making it matter. Even now, if you taste it, it'll remind you what resourcefulness once tasted like. Sorghum drizzled sweet potatoes were nature's candy for people who couldn't afford much else. Roasted or baked until tender, the potatoes were sliced and topped with golden sorghum syrup, thick, fragrant, and slightly bitter. That first sticky bite balanced sweetness and earthiness in perfect rhythm. It was a poor man's dessert that didn't feel poor at all. Families made it after Sunday dinner or during harvest season when potatoes were plenty. The syrup came from cane mills, often pressed by hand and sold in jars at the market. Sorghum wasn't sugar's rival. It was its soulful cousin, born of patience and labor. Sweet potatoes, meanwhile, were a gift of the land, lasting through winter and warming every meal. Together, they turned thrift into treat. Even today, the smell of roasting potatoes and warm syrup feels like coming home to a time when gratitude was the sweetest spice. Cowpea soup was the kind of meal that didn't ask for much but gave plenty back. Field peas, onions, a little salt, and maybe a smoked bone simmered together into something rich and real. The pot stayed on low all afternoon, filling the house with the smell of home. Cowpeas grew easily, surviving droughts and poor soil, much like the people who relied on them. They were full of protein, full of life, a farmer's quiet victory. You'd dip bread or cornbread into the broth, soaking up every drop. The soup stretched across days, tasting better with each reheat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, the kind of food that fed more than hunger. Around every table that served cowpea soup, there was conversation, laughter, and sometimes silence that said, "We made it through another day." Potlikker with crumbled cornbread was the southern secret of survival. After greens were cooked down, the broth left behind, rich with flavor from fatback, onions, and spice, became its own meal. Families poured it over cornbread, breaking the crust into the savory liquid until it turned thick and satisfying. Nothing was wasted, not even what others might call scraps. That broth held all the vitamins, the flavor, and the history of every meal made with care. It was soul food in its purest form, humble, hearty, and deeply nourishing. People joked that potlikker could cure a cold, but really, it cured weariness. It carried the taste of the land, the garden, and the hands that made it grow. Elders said the steam rising from a bowl could warm a heart as much as it filled a stomach. The greens might change, collards, turnips, or mustard, but the tradition stayed the same. Potlikker was the reminder that nothing good should ever be lost, not flavor, not effort, not love. A bowl of it tasted like resilience itself. Today the term still lingers, but few remember the feeling that came with it, a quiet pride in knowing nothing went to waste. Bread pudding with raisin ends was a dessert born from frugality and love. Stale bread was never thrown out. It was soaked in milk, sweetened with sugar, and baked until golden. A handful of saved raisins, often from the bottom of the jar, made it special. The pudding puffed in the oven, filling the house with a buttery warmth that made everyone smile. For many families, it was the only sweet thing they could afford, yet it felt like a feast. Some drizzled syrup over the top, others sprinkled nutmeg if they had it. Every bite told a story of making do and making joy out of scraps. It was the dessert of Saturday nights and Sunday suppers, of families who refused to let the week's hardships dull their joy. Mothers measured nothing. They just knew by sight and smell when the pudding was right. The crust at the top turned caramel brown, while the inside stayed soft, creamy, and full of comfort. Even after plates were cleared, the scent lingered, proof that sweetness didn't need wealth, only care. Bread pudding wasn't just dessert, it was testimony to the creativity of those who refused to let hard times steal their sweetness. Fried cabbage sandwiches were what happened when creativity met an empty pantry. Cabbage was sliced, sautéed in bacon grease or oil, and pressed between two slices of soft white bread. The steam softened the bread, while the crisp edges of cabbage added texture and bite. It was warm, hearty, and just greasy enough to feel indulgent. Lunches like this were quick, cheap, and satisfying. The kind you ate standing at the counter or wrapped in wax paper on your way to work. There was no waste, no pretense, just good flavor born from necessity. The best ones had a pinch of salt and a few drops of hot sauce to bring everything together. That first bite was humble magic, cabbage, bread, and a little hope, working hand in hand to keep life going. For factory workers, it was fuel. For children, it was comfort disguised as lunch. The smell lingered in the kitchen long after the meal was gone, sharp, smoky, and familiar. Each sandwich told a story of thrift and love, of hands that turned a single head of cabbage into a dozen meals. Fried cabbage sandwiches proved that simplicity could feed both hunger and heart. Okra and tomato stew was summer in a pot. Fresh okra from backyard gardens and tomatoes still warm from the sun were sliced and simmered until they became one silky, tangy dish. A little salt, a touch of pepper, and maybe some leftover corn or onion joined the mix. It bubbled quietly on the stove, thickening into comfort. Served with rice, cornbread, or just a spoon, it was a meal that filled you without emptying your wallet. The stew carried flavors from Africa and the South alike, a reminder of history, migration, and memory. Every spoonful felt like family, seasoned with heritage. Even when times were tight, dishes like this reminded folks that richness doesn't come from money. It comes from knowing how to turn sunlight and soil into supper. Sugar sandwiches were born from empty cupboards and the will to make something sweet out of nothing. All it took was plain white bread, a swipe of margarine, and a light dusting of sugar. Simple ingredients that somehow tasted like kindness. You could hear the crunch of the sugar crystals between your teeth, feel the soft pull of the bread, and smell the faint scent of butter that made the whole house feel warmer. For children, it was a treat. For adults, it was survival with a smile. When times were hard, a loaf of bread stretched across days, feeding imagination as much as hunger. Mothers made sugar sandwiches to quiet rumbling bellies, and fathers took them to work wrapped in wax paper. It was a dessert that cost next to nothing but delivered comfort in abundance. Sometimes the bread was toasted, sometimes it wasn't. Every house had its way. No one thought of it as poor man's food then. It was simply life, sweetened where it could be. Today, the thought of it might seem strange, but for many, it was the taste of love when love was all there was left to give. Greens and cornmeal dumplings were what happened when necessity met genius. Turnip or mustard greens simmered low and slow until tender, flavored with fatback or ham hock if you were lucky. Into that savory pot went spoonfuls of thick cornmeal dough, heavy, hearty, and filling. The dumplings soaked up the potlikker, swelling into soft, earthy pockets of comfort. This was the kind of dish that stretched a single pot into a full family meal. It smelled of home, of steam rising from the stove and windows fogged with warmth. Kids might not have liked the greens, but they loved those dumplings floating on top like small golden clouds. Every bite reminded you that simple food could feel rich when it came from hands that worked hard and hearts that cared. Cooking it took patience, but it rewarded you with flavor deep enough to make you forget the struggle. In many Southern homes, this dish was a reminder that even the humblest vegetables could become a feast with a little imagination. It wasn't just survival. It was soul, seasoned slow. Peanut soup was a bowl of history carried forward from Africa to America, and then from generation to generation. Peanuts were ground by hand or pounded with a wooden pestle until they became thick, creamy paste. Added to boiling water or broth with onions and salt, it turned into something rich, smooth, and deeply satisfying. For families who could not afford meat, this soup provided the protein they needed to keep going. The smell was earthy, nutty, and soothing, like warmth you could taste. Served with rice, cornbread, or even plain crackers, it turned thrift into nourishment. This dish crossed oceans and survived centuries, reminding people of their ancestors with every spoonful. It was not fancy, but it carried pride. Mothers taught daughters to make it by feel, not by measurement. A handful of peanuts, a pinch of salt, and love stirred in between. Even today, when you taste peanut soup, you can feel the memory of those who made do with what the earth gave them and still found a way to make it beautiful. Onion gravy and biscuits made mornings feel alive again. The sizzle of onions in a cast-iron pan filled the kitchen long before sunrise. Fried in leftover grease and sprinkled with flour, the onions darkened into something rich and aromatic. Water or milk was poured in, and the gravy thickened, bubbling low as the smell drifted through the house. Fresh biscuits baked alongside, soft and golden, ready to soak up every drop. It was breakfast made from scraps, the ends of the flour bag, yesterday's drippings, and the will to start another day right. Workers ate it before heading to the fields or the factory, children before school. Each bite tasted smoky, buttery, and a little sweet from the caramelized onions. No meat, no fancy ingredients, just the alchemy of care turning cheap ingredients into gold. The gravy coated your fingers, your plate, your heart. Onion gravy and biscuits were proof that flavor could rise from hardship, and that no kitchen, no matter how small, was ever truly empty. Boiled cabbage and cornmeal cakes turned two humble staples into something close to perfect balance. The cabbage, boiled soft with a bit of salt and maybe a bone for flavor, released a scent both sharp and soothing. On the side, cornmeal cakes sizzled in a skillet, crisp at the edges, tender in the middle. Eaten together, they offered everything a body needed: warmth, weight, and comfort. This was weekday cooking for families who had to stretch every penny. Cabbage was cheap, reliable, and plentiful, while cornmeal was the backbone of nearly every poor man's kitchen. The cakes soaked up the potlikker from the cabbage, blending textures and tastes that lingered. There were no leftovers, just satisfied sighs and clean plates. Sometimes the meal was seasoned with only pepper and patience, yet it still felt whole. It was the kind of dinner that made you grateful for what little you had and proud of how well you could make it work. Boiled cabbage and cornmeal cakes might not turn heads today, but once upon a time they filled every heart and home they touched. Candied carrots and molasses were sweet salvation when sugar ran short. Carrots, cheap and easy to grow, were peeled and sliced thin before being simmered in molasses until they glistened like amber. The thick syrup coated them in sticky sweetness, transforming an ordinary root into something worthy of Sunday supper. For many families, this was as close as they came to dessert. Children waited by the stove, spoons ready to sneak a taste before it cooled. The air smelled of warmth, part earth, part sugar, part love. It wasn't about luxury. It was about gratitude. Molasses gave flavor when nothing else could, rich and dark like the soil itself. Candied carrots reminded people that sweetness didn't have to come from abundance. It could come from effort, from care, from the art of turning hardship into joy. Each bite was a quiet victory, proof that even in lean times, life could still be sweet. Chicken back stew was a dish made from what others threw away. The backs, bony and often discarded, were cleaned, seasoned, and slow-cooked until every bit of flavor had been coaxed out. Mixed with potatoes, onions, and sometimes a little rice, it became a pot of gold. The smell filled the house, reminding everyone that patience could turn scraps into soul food. Families would gather around the table, bowls in hand, grateful for the warmth and nourishment. The meat might have been small, but the taste was mighty. It stretched across meals, sometimes lasting 2 or 3 days. Nothing wasted, nothing taken for granted. Chicken back stew was more than survival. It was pride in making the most out of what the world handed you. The broth was rich, the meat tender, and the spirit behind it unshakable. In every humble bowl was the story of how resilience learned to taste like comfort. Sweet rice with butter was a breakfast that felt like a blessing. White rice cooked soft and steaming, stirred with butter until glossy, then sweetened with sugar if you could spare it. Simple, creamy, and warm, the kind of meal that hugged you from the inside. For children, it was the morning equivalent of dessert. For adults, it was an easy way to feed a family before work. The rice came from big sacks that lasted months, stretching across seasons and paychecks alike. There was no waste, no fancy garnish, just warmth, sweetness, and strength. The butter melted into every grain, filling the bowl with richness that felt far beyond its cost. Sweet rice made you forget how little you had, if only for a few minutes. It taught a quiet lesson about abundance, that comfort didn't come from plenty, but from making something good out of something small. Crumbled crackers and milk were the poor man's breakfast cereal long before boxes filled supermarket aisles. When cornflakes or oatmeal ran out, saltine crackers took their place. They were crushed into a bowl covered with cold milk and sprinkled with a little sugar if it was on hand. The result was simple and honest: soft, salty, slightly sweet. It filled the stomach and calmed the mind. Elders swore by it as a night snack, too, saying it helped you sleep better. Children loved the sound of the crackers crackling in the milk before they softened. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like care. Many families passed down this habit not because they had to, but because they wanted to remember where they came from. Crumbled crackers in milk were comfort disguised as thrift, a reminder that the simplest things often taste the best. Pan-fried liver spread on toast was the kind of dish that divided opinions but united generations. Liver was cheap, full of iron, and always available when other meats were out of reach. It was fried in a skillet until browned, mashed with onions and seasoning, and spread thick over toast or biscuits. The taste was rich, metallic, and deeply familiar to those who grew up with it. In the mornings, it paired with black coffee. At night, it was eaten cold straight from the icebox. This was food that didn't waste a thing. Even the toughest cuts had purpose. Parents insisted it made children strong, while kids wrinkled their noses but ate it anyway. The smell lingered in the air long after the pan cooled, earthy and proud. Liver on toast wasn't a luxury, but it was nourishment in every sense. It filled more than bellies. It filled history, teaching that sustenance is sometimes an act of courage. Corn shuck soup was a dish that made something out of what most folks threw away. In the countryside, when kernels were picked clean and cobs were bare, nothing went to waste. The husks and cobs were washed and boiled in big iron pots until the water turned golden and fragrant, tasting faintly of sweetness and smoke. Onions, salt, and maybe a scrap of ham bone found their way in if times were good. Families sat around the table sipping that broth, sometimes thickened with a handful of cornmeal or a knob of butter. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. A poor man's chowder that warmed the belly and calmed the spirit. The sound of the pot bubbling slow was as steady as a heartbeat in homes where work never ended and money never stayed. Corn shuck soup was never about plenty. It was about wisdom, the kind that told you to use everything the earth gave. Even without meat or milk, it tasted like care. For those who grew up on it, the smell alone could pull them back to wood stoves, tin cups, and the steady rhythm of making do. Homemade syrup pop was the sweet fizz of imagination long before soft drinks came cheap. A spoonful of cane or sorghum syrup mixed with cold water and poured over chipped ice could cool a whole afternoon. The taste was simple, caramel sweet, and just strong enough to make kids smile through the heat. In towns where a bottle of soda cost too much, syrup pop was the poor man's refreshment, made right in the kitchen, stirred with laughter. Some families added a squeeze of lemon or a drop of vanilla. Others left it plain, content with the bubbles that danced on their tongues. Mothers would mix it up in big mason jars and hand them to children sitting on porches or leaning against door frames. It was more than a drink. It was an act of care on sweltering days when air barely moved. The syrup stuck to your fingers, the ice melted too fast, but the memory lingered longer than any store-bought treat. That sweetness was a kind of joy people made for themselves. No brand, no label, just life poured over ice. Tomato gravy over rice was supper for the weary, a poor man's red sauce that carried the soul of Sunday in every spoonful. It started with canned or leftover tomatoes, cooked down in a skillet with flour and grease until thick and rich. The gravy shimmered red and gold in the light, the smell a mix of tang, smoke, and comfort. Over a bed of white rice, it became a meal that stretched far beyond its cost. Some added a bit of sugar to soften the acid, others dropped in chopped onions or pepper flakes for depth. It was the kind of dish that tasted like home no matter how humble the setting. The first bite hit sweet, then savory, then warm. Proof that flavor didn't need a fortune. In many kitchens, tomato gravy meant a day without meat, but not without pride. It was served to children after church, to tired workers late at night, to families who knew that love could turn even canned tomatoes into something sacred. Every plate carried the taste of resilience, the art of making small things feel grand. Blackstrap pudding was the dessert of those who refused to let bitterness define them. Made from molasses, cornmeal, and water, it baked into a dark, sticky pudding that glistened under the light. The taste was deep, smoky and sweet all at once, a mix of earth and sugar that lingered long after the plate was clean. Blackstrap molasses was thick, almost bitter, but when mixed with patience and heat, it turned into something rich and kind. Mothers would bake it in old pans, the smell filling the house with warmth that hid the day's worries. It was often the only sweet thing to end the week with, and families treated it like a holiday. Served warm, maybe with a little milk poured over top, it tasted like effort rewarded. The pudding clung to the spoon, heavy and dense but full of comfort. It was not just dessert, it was proof that the poorest homes could still make luxury from leftovers. Blackstrap pudding was the sweetness of endurance baked right into the pan, dark but shining, humble but unforgettable. Fried potato peels were the poor man's chips, crisp, salty, and born from the stubborn refusal to waste. When families peeled potatoes for supper, the skins went straight into a skillet of hot grease instead of the trash. They curled up golden and crunchy, hissing softly as they fried. Sprinkled with salt or a little pepper, they were devoured before they even hit the table. Children snatched them straight from the pan, fingers burning but too happy to care. Some added a drizzle of vinegar, others a shake of paprika, but most times, simplicity did the job just fine. The smell was pure comfort, a reminder that waste was a luxury few could afford. Fried peels were not side dishes or snacks, they were lessons. Lessons about thrift, about joy in scraps, about turning nothing into something that made everyone smile. Even now, the sound of sizzling skins can transport you back to those kitchens where nothing was wasted, not even the peel of a potato. Baked onions stuffed with rice were meals tucked inside a shell of sweetness. The onions were peeled, hollowed, and boiled just long enough to soften their layers. Inside went cooked rice, maybe a spoon of fat drippings or bits of vegetables saved from other meals. Baked slow until golden, they filled the air with a fragrance that was both hearty and delicate. Each onion was a portion, a little miracle for one. When money was tight, this dish made a handful of rice feed an entire family. The juices from the onion seeped into the rice, making every bite rich without costing a dime extra. Some added breadcrumbs for crunch or herbs if the garden had any to spare. You didn't need meat. You needed time, care, and the willingness to let simple things become enough. Onions stuffed with rice were the picture of modest beauty, glowing in the oven like lanterns of perseverance. When served, they looked small but felt enormous, the kind of food that fills both stomach and spirit. Pig ear sandwiches were the working man's delicacy, found at corner stands, barbershops, and small cafes where the air smelled of grease and conversation. The ears were cleaned, boiled tender, then fried or grilled until just chewy enough. Pressed between soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, they were eaten standing up, napkin in hand, laughter all around. It wasn't fancy food. It was real food. Pig ears carried the flavor of hard labor and long days, of people who knew how to make the most of every part of the animal. The texture was slick and chewy, the taste smoky and rich. To outsiders, it might have looked strange, but to those who grew up with it, it was soul food at its best. Each bite was a story of survival, culture, and pride, of communities that turned what others threw away into something worth lining up for. Pig ear sandwiches weren't about wealth, they were about heritage. They told the story of people who turned grit into grace, one sandwich at a time. Cold rice with evaporated milk was breakfast for mornings when money was short and time was shorter. Leftover rice from supper went into a bowl, and thick, sweet evaporated milk was poured right over it. Maybe a spoonful of sugar, maybe not. Either way, it tasted like a quiet kind of comfort. The milk turned silky as it touched the cold rice, making every spoonful feel like dessert. This was food that expected nothing but gave everything. Mothers served it to children before school, fathers ate it before heading to work, and elders swore it soothed an uneasy stomach. It was cheap, quick, and gentle, the kind of meal that hugged you from the inside. On hot days, it cooled you down. On bad days, it lifted you up. There was no shame in it, only gratitude. Cold rice with evaporated milk was simplicity itself, a soft echo of sweetness in hard times. It reminded everyone that comfort doesn't have to be warm, it just has to be there. Cornmeal custard pie was the poor man's golden treasure. It began with the simplest pantry staples: cornmeal, milk, eggs, and a little sugar if you could spare it. Baked until the edges turned crisp and the center trembled softly, it emerged from the oven smelling like sunlight and home. The cornmeal gave it a faint crunch, the custard brought silkiness, and the combination was magic. The first bite was sweet and buttery, with just a hint of grit that reminded you where it came from. Families baked it for Sunday dinner, holidays, or simply when they needed something to smile about. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt special, a dessert that belonged to everyone. Some flavored it with nutmeg, others with a splash of vanilla, but all agreed it was comfort made visible. When the knife cut into it, the golden filling shimmered like promise. Cornmeal custard pie was the taste of home's resilience, simple, glowing, unforgettable. Boiled turnips and cornbread crumbs made the kind of supper that proved pride could live even in poverty. Turnips, peeled and simmered soft, brought a mild sweetness that balanced their earthy bitterness. Crumbled cornbread soaked in their broth, thickening it into something halfway between stew and salvation. The smell was humble: steam, salt, and a whisper of smoke from the pot. This was food made from what the land gave freely, the kind that filled bellies when there was nothing left to buy. People ate it slow, savoring each spoonful not for its richness, but for what it represented. Another day endured, another family fed. Sometimes the turnip greens were added in too, giving color and strength to the mix. Around those tables, there were no complaints, only quiet conversation and the rhythm of gratitude. Boiled turnips and cornbread crumbs were more than supper. They were symbols of survival, of people who learned how to make enough out of almost nothing. Baked raccoon with sweet potatoes was a hearty, deeply flavorful dish that reflected the ingenuity of rural African-American hunting communities. When store-bought meat was scarce or too costly, raccoon provided a source of fresh protein for those who knew how to prepare it properly. The raccoon meat was carefully cleaned, soaked to remove any strong flavors, and then seasoned with herbs, onions, and spices before being baked low and slow. Sweet potatoes, sliced thick and arranged around the meat, soaked up the savory juices as they roasted, creating a sweet and salty pairing that filled the house with an irresistible aroma. This dish was not only about nourishment, it was about community and the skill of turning what the land provided into a meal worth gathering for. Often prepared during the cooler months after a successful hunt, it brought people together around the table to share stories and warmth. While today most people have never tasted raccoon, those who grew up with it remember its richness, the tender texture, and the way the sweet potatoes balanced its earthiness. It was more than just dinner. It was a reminder of self-sufficiency and resourceful cooking passed down through generations. Chilled showstopper of warm weather socials, a snowy white vision that cooled the hottest summer evenings. A light sponge cake baked in a large rectangular pan provided the base, while a creamy coconut frosting made with evaporated milk and sweetened shredded coconut blanketed the top like fresh snow. After chilling, the cake absorbed the frosting's rich flavor, turning each bite into a tender tropical treat. Served in generous squares at backyard picnics or family reunions, it delivered sweetness without heaviness, perfect after barbecue or spicy foods. Guests admired the way the coconut caught the light, sparkling like tiny crystals as the cake was sliced. In African-American households of the 1970s, coconut sheet cake became a seasonal favorite that signaled celebration and hospitality. Its simplicity and ability to feed a crowd made it a practical choice, while its striking appearance ensured it was remembered long after the last square disappeared from the platter. Lemon chess pie shone with bright flavor. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and Old World methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Homemade cane. Syrup drizzle once gave biscuits and pancakes a dark, smoky sweetness unmatched by refined sugar. Families would harvest sugarcane, crush the stalks, and boil the juice in large iron kettles until it thickened into a rich amber syrup. The work was hot and sticky, often stretching from dawn until late night, but the reward was a flavor that defined Southern breakfasts and holiday treats. Children watched the bubbling kettles with wide eyes, waiting for a chance to taste the warm syrup on a fresh biscuit. Neighbors often shared the labor and the finished product, turning the syrup-making into a community event as well as a culinary one. Over time, industrial sweeteners and store-bought syrups replaced the careful craft, and the knowledge of how to coax sweetness from cane faded with older generations. For those who remember, a spoonful of homemade cane syrup is more than a taste. It is a memory of family unity, hard work, and the sweetness that perseverance can bring. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Fatback fried cabbage was a simple, deeply satisfying dish that turned a humble head of cabbage into a flavorful side worth remembering. Fatback, a cured slab of pork fat with a rich, salty taste, was diced and fried until it released its golden drippings. Into this savory base went shredded cabbage, sizzling as it hit the hot pan and slowly softening while soaking up all the flavor. The edges browned slightly, giving a hint of caramelization, while the tender leaves carried the smoky richness of the pork. This was a dish that needed no complicated seasoning, just salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. In African American kitchens, especially in the rural South, fatback fried cabbage was an easy way to feed a family, served alongside cornbread and beans or as part of a larger spread. It represented the practice of using every part of what was available, from the vegetables in the garden to the trimmings from a butchered hog. Today, while cabbage is still common, the tradition of frying it in fatback has faded, replaced by lighter cooking methods, but its flavor remains unforgettable to those who grew up eating it. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers delivered pure comfort in a chilled dish that always seemed to disappear before anyone could ask for seconds. Ripe bananas were sliced thin and layered with crisp vanilla wafers and creamy custard made from milk, eggs, and a hint of vanilla bean. Each layer softened as the pudding rested, allowing the cookies to turn cake-like while the bananas infused the custard with gentle sweetness. A crown of meringue or whipped cream sealed the top, lightly browned in the oven or served fresh from the refrigerator depending on family tradition. Sunday dinners and church socials alike relied on this dessert to close the meal with something cool, sweet, and familiar. Children loved sneaking extra wafers, while adults traded stories over heaping spoonfuls. Banana pudding with vanilla wafers captured the heart of community gatherings in the 1970s, proving that the simplest combination of fruit, cream, and cookies could create a dessert experience that felt luxurious, comforting, and timeless all at once. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting brought roasted sassafras roots provided a fragrant tea with a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor that refreshed the spirit and offered mild stimulation. Enslaved gatherers carefully dug the young roots of the sassafras tree, washed them, and roasted them over gentle heat to draw out their aromatic oils. When steeped in hot water, the roasted roots released a deep reddish brew with notes of vanilla and citrus. This tea was enjoyed both for its taste and for traditional medicinal uses, reflecting a blend of African and indigenous knowledge about native plants. After emancipation, sassafras tea became a beloved Southern beverage, eventually serving as the base flavor for the first root beers. The practice demonstrates how a simple foraged root shaped a lasting American flavor that extends far beyond its humble beginnings. Roasted sassafras roots show how understanding the forest's offerings allowed communities to create drinks of comfort and cultural significance from ingredients freely given by the land itself. Field pea salad with hot pepper vinegar offered a cool bite for the hottest southern evenings. Tender field peas were boiled until just soft, then chilled and tossed with diced onions, sweet peppers, and a splash of sharp vinegar infused with fiery peppers. The salad balanced earthy legumes with a bright tang that woke the palate after long days in the sun. Served on wide porches as cicadas sang, it accompanied fried chicken, grilled fish, or simply a hunk of cornbread. Home gardeners prized field peas for their reliability in poor soil, and the vinegar peppers were often homemade, steeped for weeks in glass bottles on sunny windowsills. Guests at summer suppers remembered the sting of the vinegar and the gentle sweetness of the peas as the taste of true Southern hospitality. Today, packaged beans and bottled dressings have replaced the careful soaking and seasoning that once defined the dish, but the memory of its crisp, refreshing bite lingers in kitchens where tradition still holds strong. In the 1960s, Fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort. Food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Hoe cakes were more than just cornmeal pancakes. They were a connection to labor, history, and home. Made from a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, they were cooked on flat iron griddles, skillets, or even the flat side of a hoe blade over an open fire. This made them quick to prepare in the fields or at home, perfect for feeding hungry workers. Hoe cakes had a crisp edge, soft center, and a flavor that paired well with everything from syrup to savory stews. In African American history, they represented sustenance during long days and ingenuity in cooking methods. They could be eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what was available to serve alongside them. While modern kitchens have replaced open fires, the memory of hoe cakes remains tied to family stories and community meals. Their simplicity made them timeless, yet their presence on tables today is far less common than it once was. Chinquapin nut cakes offered small moments of sweetness, created from the rich forests of the American South. The chinquapin, a dwarf chestnut native to the region, produced small, sweet nuts that could be eaten raw or roasted. Enslaved families collected these nuts in autumn, cracked their shells, and ground the meat into a fine meal. Mixed with a little cornmeal, honey, or molasses when available, the nut meal formed small cakes that were baked or cooked on a griddle until golden brown. These cakes carried both nutrition and a sense of celebration, providing rare treats for special gatherings. The flavor, slightly sweeter than a chestnut with a buttery finish, became a cherished memory passed down through generations. Even after emancipation, chinquapin nuts remained a prized wild harvest in Appalachian and southern communities, though the trees have grown scarce in modern times. Chinquapin nut cakes remind us of the connection between forest abundance and human creativity, transforming a foraged ingredient into a dessert that honored both the landscape and the people who carefully tended its secrets. If these stories stirred a hunger you almost forgot, share your own memories in the comments. Press like to keep them alive and subscribe so the taste of our history never fades from the table.